In Print Radio. In Print is a professional writers organization located in Rockford, Illinois. We're dedicated to providing resources and education off the page and on the air. Hello, I'm Bob Francis. Today, In Print member Philip Warden sits down with writer Cynthia Clampitt.
Thank you for coming here today. Would you tell me a bit about yourself?
Okay, well, I'm a writer, obviously, and I am a food historian and a world traveler, and I do a lot of public speaking that covers sort of both the food history and the travel. I've been to 37 countries on 6 continents, but I'm best known, of course, for Australia because of the book Waltzing Australia. But Waltzing Australia was pretty much where my writing career started over. I was in the corporate world for 10 years and decided that the corporate world was not for me. So I tried graduate school for a year while still working, and then realized that that wasn't where my future lay, and then decided that the only way to have a writing career was to just walk away and have a writing career, that as long as I tried to do it in my free time in the corporate world, because anybody who's in the corporate world knows you actually don't get free time. So if I was ever going to have a writing career, I needed to quit, and I needed to go do something other than the corporate world. So that's when I went to Australia, and I came home, and I built a new career. I've written for pretty much every educational publisher in the country, including National Geographic and the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. I write a lot of magazine articles, and I really like writing books.
And why a writer? Why was that your dream?
Well, it's one of those things where I always did it when I was younger. I mean, I've always written, but I think it's one of those things where you just, in a very practical world, you don't think in terms of, I'm going to grow up to breathe, I'm going to grow up to be a woman. Well, it's, yes, of course you're a woman, and of course you're going to breathe. But writing was the same thing. It was so much a part of who I was that it didn't even occur to me as a career. And largely because, like I said, growing up in the 50s and 60s, people tended to think in terms of, oh, well, of course you'll have a corporate career and you can write in your free time if you want, but that's not a real career. That's not what grown-ups do. It was sort of like being an artist. It's like painters and writers were kind of those people that you didn't want to encourage too much. Get a real job and you can do your writing,
I've watched Moulin Rouge, I know that feeling.
Okay, exactly. And so, plus, of course, being a woman, I was growing up in the 50s and 60s where everybody just said, well, you'll just go to college to get a good husband. And it was sort of like, why am I not being encouraged to have a career? Why am I not being encouraged to pursue anything I want to do? And that was why, is they just assumed that you'd get married, have children, and that would be settled, and your husband would tell you what you wanted to do. And I think that's I want to make sure people know I'm not down on marriage. I think marriage is wonderful for most people. It just wasn't the road I was interested in traveling. And it was like the writing. It was, like I said, 10 years in the corporate world, I suddenly occurred to me, I'm now responsible for the rest of my life, and I need to figure out what I want to do. And it's not the corporate world. And I'm also not down on the corporate world. I think there's some good companies. It's just not right for me. It's just the metaphor I use in the book is, it's kind of like the corporate world is like chess. And chess has beautiful game pieces and clever strategies, but I play Scrabble. I'm about words. I don't play chess. I really don't like chess. I don't like strategy. I like just coming up with great words.
I like both games.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's terrific. It's just, for me, it worked as a metaphor, too. But no, I don't hate chess. I just don't particularly like it.
Speaking of strategy, after you came back from Australia, what was the whole process of getting this book together, of Waltzing Australia?
Well, the book is actually was comprised basically of my notes from while I went over there, because when I went over, I went with the idea of being a writer. So I took scads of paper and a notebook, and I just wrote every single day, pages and pages and pages. And it was funny because I actually mailed it home to my mom like every 4 weeks, just because you don't want to carry it all and risk losing it. So I kept mailing it home, and when I came home and Mom had put it all in a notebook and showed me, it was 2 inches thick. And I was like, wow, I wrote a lot, didn't I? And so it looked like a book, but I kind of put it on a shelf for a little while because I needed a source of income. I had quit the corporate world. I needed to find writing work. So I actually did a stint in retail, like a lot of actors and artists and writers do. You do a little bit of something that's really awful just because you need to make money. It gave me medical insurance, and it gave me enough money for beans and rice for about a year or two. And then I used every spare moment to write, and I started getting magazine articles published, and I started getting jobs, especially because of the Australia thing. I got jobs with educational publishers who were going, can you come and write about Australia? Nobody else knows anything. So I started writing geography books, and then they say, wow, you're pretty good at this. Why don't you stay on with us and you can write more? So I freelanced for about 7 years for Scott Forsman, educational textbook publisher, doing high school textbooks. I have a degree in language arts, so I started working on their language arts programs too. So anyway, I built the career up, and by the time I had a happy ending, because the original notebook ends with, I'm on the plane going home, how do I keep the dream alive? And I didn't want to end the book with that. So basically, by the time I had built the writing career, which took a few years, then I felt like I had a happy ending, and I could actually go back and write the book and have it be, here's this great adventure, and by the way, here's how it turned out. I've been back to Australia, I've been to all these other countries, I've had this fabulous life, I've published hundreds of articles, and I'm having this wonderful time, and it all came true, and basically sum it up with, dreams can come true if you're willing to pay the price. It's sort of the classic overnight success story, where you spend 15 years being an overnight success. So it was just one of those things I wanted people to see, that it was a lot of work, it wasn't easy, but that it was worth it in the long term.
So you didn't just get home from the plane and get this all going?
No. I had already, written it. I kept reading about Australia. It was one of those things where, for me, accuracy is so important, getting the facts right. So what I did when I got home, I had read a lot before the trip so that I knew where I wanted to go and when and what there was to see. But when I got home, I started reading even more, just so that I would have the information, that I could check things. It's one of the things I did learn is no matter how well-intended guides are, even they get stuff wrong. And I've actually been in museums where you've seen the sticker next to some picture or something, and you're going, that's not right. So it's one of the reasons I always tell people, if you're writing anything, check at least 2 sources, because everybody gets something right. Encyclopedia Britannica has occasional errors. So it's one of those things, always have 2 sources. So that was sort of what I did. It wasn't that I just didn't do anything, but I figured, okay, I'll just read about Australia. I get that. But then I also wanted to build a career. So it sort of continued as a thread in my life, but no, I didn't really jump on the book as soon as I got home.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah.
I was afraid it was just me.
Yeah, no.
Okay, so you've established the career, and you've started to write this again with a happy ending.
Yes.
After that, how did you get it into this book form?
Well, I created it to be a book, and this is actually one of those things where it's nice to have my brother and sister-in-law. My brother's in advertising, and he's an artist, and my sister-in-law is in publishing. And so after sending it out to a lot of publishers and a lot of agents who were all enthusiastic about it, it's like I actually had one agent write to me that it reminded him of Annie Dillard at her best. And you're going, wow, that's cool. He's going to want to do the book. And then he goes, however, and there's always that however. Publishers that was like, we love it. And I actually got a phone call from a publisher who says, we absolutely love it, but we don't think there's much interest in Australia. But we'd like to hang on to the manuscript for a few more days because there's 3 other people in the office that want to read it. So I kept getting this incredibly positive feedback, but nobody, there was always that however. So I eventually actually went with, and that's one of the reasons why it's a good thing I didn't do it right away, because print on demand came into existence. Book Surge came up. I actually had some great reviews for the back cover because people did love it. And so that was nice. But it was just one of those things where I just went to my brother and sister-in-law and said, hi, can you help me design this book and create it and everything, and then uploaded it on Book Search, and so it's available through print on demand. And then I went to, back 2 years later when ebooks started coming out, I created an ebook version too, so you can now get it for Kindle and Nook and your iPhone and everything else. But it was basically, even though I had published several books through traditional publishers, nobody cared about Australia, which is odd because I've never talked to anybody who's not interested in Australia. I just sort of wonder where these publishers are, living, and I guess most of them are in New York, and maybe they don't care about Australia, but everybody else seems to be interested.
Now, you mentioned that was POD publish?
Print on demand, yes.
Print on demand. Okay, that's what that meant.
Yes, which is actually a wonderful alternative to old-fashioned self-publishing, because old-fashioned self-publishing, you have to print like 10,000 books or 5,000 books, and you have to pay for all of them. You pay for going on press. And so it could cost you $20,000, $30,000. Whereas with print on demand, now they do offer the service of putting the book together for you, but since I had a brother who's a designer and a sister-in-law who's in publishing, I could go to them and have them do the layout and the setting it up so it could be a PDF and be just right. And print on demand, they don't print it till you order it. So you don't have to have a basement full of, that was the other thing. I live in an apartment, so what do you do with 10,000 books? A lot of people, exactly, but a lot of people have, basements full of books that they'll never get rid of. With me, it was like, okay, if the publishers and the agents are right and nobody cares about Australia, then I'm out, I'm out a couple $100. And if I'm wrong, I haven't invested or lost that much. But if I'm right, then people can have access to this. And it's actually done quite nicely. I mean, it's sold fairly steadily. I think since it came out originally in 2007, there's only been 2 months that I didn't have sales. So it's sold pretty steadily. And of course, with the speaking and everything else, once people see the pictures of Australia, they're going, wow, I need to know more. So it's worked out quite well. But fortunately, that's not where the story ended. I mean, there's lots of other writing going on in my life, including more traditional publishers.
We have to take a break, but Philip will be back with more of his interview with Cynthia right after this. Welcome back. Imprint member Philip Warden is talking with writer Cynthia Clampitt.
I'm guessing with this you had to market your own?
Yes.
How did that go?
It was a combination of course, a lot of the online stuff. I have a blog called Waltzing Australia, cleverly enough. I have a Facebook page. I'm on LinkedIn, but I also do a lot of public speaking. So I got into speakers bureaus, like the Chicago Writers Association has a speakers bureau. So I do a lot of public speaking, and that helps. And so it was a combination of the public speaking and the online presence. And of course, anytime I published an article, the little blurb at the bottom was Cynthia Clampitt is a freelance writer and the author of the award-winning travel narrative Waltzing Australia. That's another thing I did too, though, is I did send it in to a few award people that offered awards, and I won the Mom's Choice Award for travel writing in 2010. That gives you a little more publicity because they publish that a lot. So it's just one of those things where you just do what you can. But like I said, the speaking and the online presence have been very useful. And also, I should say, there's a bazillion places out there if you're a writer. I went to Goodreads. I got the book out there, and people started reviewing it and putting the reviews out there, and Author's Den, and any place that I could find where I could go, hi, here's my book, pay attention. And that it's all sort of worked pretty well. I mean, not to the level that like some giant multi-$1,000 advertising campaign would have done, but it's, like I said, it's sold fairly steadily for, about 6.5 years now.
And you said you've been to other countries. Have you written about any others?
I've written articles. I have written mostly magazine things. I've also written on my blog. One of the things I did when I went to Morocco, well, I always take notes everywhere I go. I always come back with just pages and pages and pages and pages of notes. Interestingly enough, here's a tip for protecting your brain. Not only does writing longhand help you remember things, it's actually so powerful for your memory that they have found that it actually reduces your risk of Alzheimer's disease. am happy to take notes everywhere I go. But I took, I think, 160 pages of notes when I was in Morocco. And so I had been traveling with somebody, and she said, "Oh, can you type them up for me?" So I typed them all up. And this is another place you can get readers and interested in your work, as I put them all on Wattpad. Wattpad is a writers community created by Publishers Weekly. They actually have a thing that you can select that says, let people know who I am and feel free to discover me. And so I put that out there, and it's had 16,000 reads, because they actually track how many people have read it. So it's 16,000 reads just for the notebook. I mean, I didn't even have to tart it up. I mean, I explained at the beginning, by the way, these are just notes, so that it's not going to be in perfect book format. And so there's a lot of bullet points and things like that, and a few incomplete sentences. But I've gotten huge positive feedback, and like I said, 16,000 reads. So they're just different ways like that, because there are a lot of writer communities. And if I don't want to spend a huge amount of time out there, because about 2/3 of it is vampires and romance novels. But they do actually, and this is actually one of these that's kind of fun, is Wattpad in particular cruises for nonfiction writers. So if you're writing nonfiction, so I've actually been their featured nonfiction writer, because it's just like, oh my gosh, we don't get good nonfiction writers that often. Anyway, it's just one more place. I mean, I would have never been able to publish my notebooks from Morocco traditionally in a book format, but here I have created this huge web of, and of course I mentioned Waltzing Australia there too, and I have a few excerpts on Wattpad, and the excerpts have had another 5,000 readers. So it's just one of those things where you just get your name out there. Don't give away the farm, don't put the whole book out there that you hope to sell, but make sure that people can find out what your writing's like, and it's also just good practice.
Now, okay, so you've written about Australia, and you just said Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever done United States?
Well, interestingly, yes. I just finished a book for the University of Illinois on the history of corn and how it created the Midwest. That was a lot of fun. So, I mean, I have seen a lot of the United States, been to, I think 40 of the states. But that actually helped me sort of fall in love with the Midwest, because I was doing, Iowa and Nebraska and South Dakota and Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio, and driving around and learning more about basically how this area was created. And it was absolutely fascinating. I mean, people have no idea the degree to which corn had an impact. I mean, the Midwest grew faster than any other region in the history of the world because of corn. Chicago grew faster than any other city in the history of the world because of corn. We have time zones because of corn. I mean, it's just one of those things where the corn was coming in huge quantities, and the trains were starting to bring it in. They had what they called Granger lines, Grange being a farm. So a Granger line was the trains that served the farms, and they were having trouble scheduling pickups because everybody was still sort of looking at the sun and saying, oh, it's noon. And so they said, okay, what we're going to do, the train companies divided the country into 4 sections and said, okay, we're in the middle of the country, so we're going to call it Central Standard Time, and everybody's going to change their clocks to what's correct at the 19th parallel, and then everybody's 1 hour extra going, each section going that. It was 40 years before the government went, oh, that's working pretty well, let's make it official. So it was basically because of the corn shipping in to Chicago that we have time zones.
Midwest rules.
Yeah, Midwest rules, absolutely. But there's just so many fun stories involved, too. I mean, so many family stories. I mean, I include things like everybody who writes about corn writes about feed corn. But I also include popcorn, the invention of the popcorn machine. That's actually the company still in the family. Cracker Jack, the guy who invented the corn puffs. I mean, there's just so many fun, wacky stories sometimes. I mean, the corn puffs, it was an engineer who was cleaning a rabbit food machine, and he needed something hard to clean it, sort of like, they tell you to put something hard in a garbage disposal to clean the blades. Well, he thought dried corn would be great, so he throws in the dried corn, and all of a sudden the machine is spitting out these puffy sticks. And so he picks them all up and takes them home to his wife, and she fries them, and they're great. And that's how we get corn puffs. And so, because it's Wisconsin, of course, they put cheese on them too. So basically, that's where, like, Cheetos and all your other corn, and you're just going, you can't make this stuff up. So anyway, it's just one of those things where you have all of these different stories that are involved in corn and how it created the Midwest. I mean, when you think of Chicago, the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 is legendary. I mean, it was magnificent. It was stunningly huge. People still talk about it. And yet, Chicago, only 60 years earlier, Chicago had been a small stretch of swamp with a few Indians and French traders. So in 60 years, it went from government buying a stretch of swamp from the Potawatomi to a city of 3 million people that could put on a World's Fair. So that's, 60 years. I mean, no other city has ever grown that fast. Another thing I always love as an example of how it's affected things is The Wizard of Oz was published in 1900. The idea of Kansas being this boring place just of miles and miles of cornfields where Dorothy's miserable was already a really well-established icon for Kansas. And yet, that's only 24 years after Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp were lawmen in Kansas. So it's just one of those things where the Midwest exploded, and it exploded largely because of corn. Anyway, the book's called Midwest Maze, so I have spent a good bit of time traveling around the Midwest for the book. As far as writing other things about the United States, absolutely, obviously, huge amount of textbooks. I mean, I've written vast numbers. I've worked for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and National Geographic, huge amounts of U.S. history, U.S. geography. I've written articles about food. I've also been interviewed a lot. I was interviewed last year by the New York Post on what they would have been eating in 1776, just because it was for a 4th of July special.
And what was the answer?
Well, the answer is sort of, it depends on where you live. But he says, well, we're up here in New England. So I said, lots of lobster. I said, mostly the poor people were eating lobster at that point in time. I said, lobster was so ubiquitous that contracts would frequently say, you can't feed us lobster more than 3 times a week. Just a lot of food, a lot of duck, a lot of sturgeon. Sturgeon was so common in New York that they actually referred to it as Albany beef because there was so much sturgeon. So caviar was given away free. I mean, with a beer. If you bought a beer, they would just give you caviar, and you're just going, hard to even imagine now. So anyway, it was just one of those things where it's just a huge amount of that sort of pork, of course, was still huge. Beef didn't pass pork till the early 1900s. Pork was what basically Europeans all knew, and so they brought it with them. Beef was possible later, just because once we opened the Great Plains. Until we opened the Great Plains, you had like 1 cow for milk. But once we opened the Great Plains and bought the Louisiana Purchase and all that other thing, that's when it was like, okay, now we can do cows. Now we can have herds that stretch across the horizon. So up until then, we were pretty much pork eaters. And thank goodness for cows, though, just because during the 1800s, you had guys herding herds of 10, 20,000 pigs across the plains. And I'm just going, I'm sorry, pig boys and Indians just doesn't cut it. So really glad we switched to cows. So yes, the United States, lots of that. And my blog. I mean, it's like if I take a day trip somewhere, I've done, Greenfield Village and Traverse City and all sorts of places in the area. So I like writing about just about everything.
We'll be back with more of Philip's interview with Cynthia right after this. And we're back on In Print Radio. I'm Bob Francis. In Print member Philip Warden is sitting down with author Cynthia Clampitt.
I am learning tons of stuff right now.
Oh, well, thanks.
Pigs.
That's what I love doing, yes.
Pig boys and Indians.
Yes.
That could be a cartoon.
Absolutely.
So for this Midwest Maze book that you wrote, is it being published the same way that your Whilst in Australia was?
No. This is actually I was requested to write this by the University of Illinois Press. I've been very much involved in culinary historians and Agricultural History Society and have done a lot of writing. I contributed major articles to the Food Cultures of the World Encyclopedia. Interestingly, that was on Mongolia and Jordan. But fortunately, somebody there at the press knew my work, knew I loved food history, and said, we're doing this project on the Midwest. Would you like to pick a topic? And I was like, corn. And he goes, well, we've got lots of topics. I said, corn's the only topic. I mean, it's the only thing that matters in the Midwest. And he's like, okay, go for it. So it was kind of nice to actually be requested to write the book. But it's been wonderful fun.
So is that the only way that you can get printed by a university?
Well, no, you can actually approach them just like any other publisher and send in a proposal. And I'm actually working on a proposal now. When the University of Iowa found out that I was doing a book on corn, they approached me because they're the #1 corn growing state. And I said, oh, sorry, I already signed a contract. And they said, well, what can you do for us? And I said, well, as soon as I'm through with corn, how about pigs? So they were very excited when I said, okay, I'm ready to work on the proposals. Anyway, so I'm doing the proposal now for the University of Iowa for a book on basically pigs and how they contributed to the United States history. But it's going to be a slightly different thing because corn originated in the United States. Well, not in the United States, in the Americas, in North America. It came from Oaxaca, Mexico, where it evolved from this strange little weed called teosinte. Anyway, so it was all North American. It was purely North American, and it has then since then gone out into the world, but was still always most important in the Americas. Pork, on the other hand, started in Asia and Eastern Europe. It was basically one of those things where it got domesticated in two different places around the same time. So pork has basically spread around the whole old world and then came with explorers to the United States. There were no pigs here before for the age of exploration. So it's a completely different focus. One is from here out, and this is from outside in. But it's astonishing how many stories are associated with that, too. For instance, only rabbits breed faster than pigs. So if you come over with a few pigs, it's like within a couple of years, you'll have hundreds. And so in the colonies, especially in New York on Manhattan Island, they started letting the pigs go wild because they just couldn't keep them all. Well, I ended up with massive herds of pigs just ravaging the countryside, eating farms to the ground, and they had a terrible time. And they thought, well, we have to do something. So they built a wall across the island. And, of course, then eventually they built a street along the wall, as in Wall Street. So it's just one of those things where it's just, pigs have had impact that people don't even think of.
Pigs created Wall Street in a way.
Basically. And I always thought it was kind of, now Wall Street is occupied by pigs. So anyway.
I didn't want to say that.
I understand. But, yeah. Well, it's just one of those things, and not everybody on Wall Street is bad. There is just, I think the world market has made things get out of control. I have seen that in educational publishing, for example. It used to be that educational publishers were actually based in the United States. That's one of the reasons I liked working with National Geographic and Colonial Williamsburg, is they're still U.S. based. Pretty much all the other educational publishers have been bought by overseas companies. And so the emphasis is no longer on creating great school books. The emphasis is on making the stockholders happy. And this is not my opinion. This has actually been stated in the press by those publishers. So it's one of those things where it's a different focus now. It's keeping the stockholders happy. And so the books are of less quality. A lot of the work is sent overseas, and it's sad, but it's the way it's gone. And even for writing, is all the years I spent writing textbooks. Now it'll be things like, we're doing a grammar book. There are 17 chapters. We're going to hire 17 writers. Each of you has 1 week to do a chapter, and then we have an editor who has 2 weeks to try and make it work as a whole. And you're just going, good luck with that. But nobody can make it just doing one book at a time. So I've gone back more towards the food writing again. So still do some educational stuff. I like doing readers, the book where you actually did one last year on coconuts, the history of coconuts, which was a lot of fun. It's called The Tree of Life. Here's one thing that most people don't know. There's coconut water is what's inside the coconut. The milk, you have to grate the meat and crush to make coconut milk. But the coconut water is so pure that during World War II, in the Pacific Theater, when they ran out of sterile glucose solution, they could transfuse it directly into wounded soldiers. So it really became a tree of life for a lot of soldiers. So,
okay, so that one's called The Tree of Life?
Yeah.
And who's it by?
That was published by Heinemann. So that's an educational publisher. So
yeah. It sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. I also did a couple of Australia ones for them, too. I did one on the platypus and one on the Great Barrier Reef. And because it's for kids, it was pretty much all the things that are poisonous and dangerous in the Great Barrier Reef. Gotta hook those sixth graders.
I mean, yeah, of course, because as a kid, I used to eat dirt and worms. So.
Exactly. You don't want to go out there and look at the pretty coral. I bet there's 400 species of that. You just want to go out going, wow, cool, you'll be dead in 5 minutes. So.
Yeah, a little bit of warning here.
Yeah.
That'd be helpful. So, from Waltzing Australia to Midwest Maze, have you seen your writing evolve? Have you picked up anything on your way?
Well, it's just one of those things where there are lessons that I learned early on, but that you keep relearning, and one of them is to double check your facts multiple times, or triple check your facts if possible. That's just because there's so many things out there, especially on the internet. Don't trust the internet unless there's like an EDU, and even if there's an EDU at the end of the URL, you don't want to necessarily trust it because it could be somebody's homework. So just check everything and remember that writing is work. Even if you love it, writing is still work, and you have to keep doing it. You have to keep honing it. Anyway, so yes, you learn new things, but I think it's pretty much just a matter of each time you sit down, you sort of have to relearn all the lessons because you want something to be easier. You want something to be fast, and you want to think, oh, I can just zip this out. And it's like, no, you can't.
So if I could repeat something here, you said that writing is work.
Yes.
All right, well, I'm going to go tell my mom that
Okay.
after this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, she believes that it's just play.
No. I mean, it can be if you're just doodling or something like that, but if you want to make a living at it, I mean, I was like Jack London's comment. It was, I don't wait for inspiration. I go look hunting it with a club. It's just basically you have to really keep moving. And that's one of the things, actually, that's one of the books I tend to recommend is one by Dorothea Brand called Becoming a Writer. And a lot of people have books out about how to write better and how to polish your sentences. Her book is entirely about the psychological game and how to create an almost Pavlovian response to sitting down at the keyboard. For her, keyboard was a typewriter, and for us today it's a computer, but it's still the same idea. It's just, like if you're not writing, get away from the keyboard. Only be at the keyboard when you can write, and that way sitting down at the keyboard just triggers writing. And I am actually now at a point, having followed her advice, I'm at the point where I can be completely blocked and I sit at the keyboard and it's just like, oh, okay, I'm at the keyboard, I should be writing. Here are the ideas, they're starting to come. So I love that book because it does give you the sort of the tricks of the trade, and just like any other skill, it gives you the tools. And I'd say the other book I always recommend is William Zinser's On Writing Well. That one is more along the lines of how to make the writing good. And one of my favorite quotes from that is, writing improves in direct relationship to the number of things that don't belong there that you get rid of. It's one of those things where it's one of the reasons I work a lot as an editor, too, is just having refined some of those skills, being able to help other people without destroying their voice. Yeah. It's amazingly, it is a lot of work. I mean, you have to read your writing over carefully. That's one of the things. It's like I've got my 5 rules of writing, and one of them is, of course, basically edit ruthlessly. But you have to read it as if you didn't know the topic and go, okay, this says it. What am I referring to? I find that's one of the most common errors is people using pronouns. And he went next door, and you're going, you've mentioned 4 people in the previous sentence, which he, and making sure that everything's clear. And then the other thing, too, that I remember very early in my writing career, when I was actually first writing Waltzing Australia, somebody pointed out, says, you can't say it's lovely. You have to say it's red, it's tall, you have to be precise. You have to talk about the colors of the sunset, not just say, oh, it's a beautiful sunset. You have to talk about the reds shading up to purple, shading up. Just paint pictures with your writing. So editing is frequently cutting, because nothing should be there that shouldn't be there. But it's also clarifying and describing, making it clearer, making it more vivid. So it's just like getting rid of words that are useless, like it's very tall. Well, it's 6'4". One of those things where you want to be more precise so that people read it. And that's actually one of the things I love hearing from people is they'll say, oh, it's like I'm there when they read something. And I'm going, thank you, because that's what I wanted you to feel. I wanted you to be able to read it and picture what I'm talking about. So those are some of the things to keep in mind.
We'll have more from Philip and Cynthia right after this. Welcome back. Philip Warden is talking with Cynthia Clampitt.
So for my book, I'm in the first editing process
Okay.
with going line for line. Mm-hmm. How many is normal for self-editing?
Well, first of all, one of the rules is, of course, you put it away and don't look at it for a few days before you go back to it, because if you read it right away, you'll see what you want to be there as opposed to what's there, and it's amazing how things start leaping out at you when you haven't seen it for about a week, and you're just going, holy cow, how did I miss that? You know, the number of times is, I mean, a lot of that will be established by whether you have a deadline or not, as long as you think you're still improving it. But when you get to the point where you think you're just improving, like, okay, I added a comma here, then you can start saying, okay, that's enough, because you don't want to do it forever, because everything can be improved pretty much forever. And you have to understand when you've gotten it at the point where you're not making major changes, but then have somebody else read it for you too. Because even when you're self-editing, it's still good to have input from somebody else, because I had a couple of friends proofread Waltzing Australia for me, and the questions they raised weren't about, like, oh, your writing style's bad here. It was things like, okay, what's a gum slab? Oh, it's a board made from a eucalyptus tree. Okay, we need you to explain that. So it's just one of those things where it had become so much a part of my knowledge base that it didn't even occur to me that nobody in America was going to know what I was talking about. So it's always good to have somebody else read it before it goes out into the world, until you get to the point where you're absolutely confident with your writing. And even then, it's never a bad idea, because you stop seeing things after a while when you've been working on stuff. I had somebody proofread Waltzing Australia before it went for peer review, because that's the nice thing. A university press, it goes to experts to review it so that you're not going to embarrass the university. So it's gone through 2 stages of peer review. So it's been approved by all sorts of experts in the field. But it's one of those things, somebody else ought to see it before it goes out. And like I said, if you're writing for magazines, you almost can't afford to do that, but that's okay, because that's what the editor's there for. But yeah, try to get somebody else to read it and have a feeling for it. I do that a lot for people I know who are writing books. And sometimes it's just like, I won't do the heavy editing. I'll just read a few chapters and just say, here's where your shortcomings are. Here's what your pitfalls are. Here's what you have to look for. Here's what you need to expand on. Like I said, read it a few times, have somebody else read it to see where they're going, what, and then move on from there. There is no specific number. I mean, it's one of those things where the farther along you get in your career, the fewer times it will probably be, because you will become more confident in your writing. You'll know what to look for better. You know, you get better at knowing, it's like, oh, that's not going to work. Oh, that has to go. Now, one of the things I do say, though, is like, if you're cutting something, because that was one of the things with Waltzing Australia, I cut a lot of little vignettes and stuff where it was just like, oh, there's this adorable little boy on the train and he's trying to get the conductor to take his money, and that's really, it didn't belong in the book. It was stupid. But I have a blog, so it's like, if you have great little vignettes, you can just say, okay, here's something I cut from the book, but I wanted to share it with you anyway. So you don't have to necessarily throw out things. I always, when I'm working in a book, I always have a document for things that I'm cutting that I like well enough that I want to use them somewhere else. Anyway, does that answer your question at all?
That does, actually.
Okay, good.
I thought I was looking at a lot more work ahead of me and a specific number.
No, it's not a specific number, because, like I said, as you get further along in your writing career, you will know what to look for. And so that's one of the things that helps, is if you start looking at okay, I wrote it here, what does that refer to? Is that clear? Can I make this a little clearer? It's sort of like know thyself, the old advice of know thyself. So you begin to know where you might fall short as a writer, and you start looking for those things. So it becomes easier with time, so it's not a specific number. It will be a lot more earlier in your career than it is later.
Earlier, you mentioned you had 5 rules of writing.
Yeah, I've taught a couple of nonfiction classes. I think this would probably actually work for fiction as well. My rules of writing, the first one is care deeply. A lot of people just write stuff because they think they can get a paycheck. And the thing is that for caring, you have 3 possible things to care about: the topic, the audience, and the craft of writing. And you really only need 2 out of 3. So even if you hate the topic, as long as you care about the craft of writing and your audience, you can still do good writing. I wrote about 2 years for a quarterly newsletter for a company that creates the signs for the sides of trucks. Not a high on my list topic, not something where I get up in the morning going, hey, today I get to write about. trucks. I want to do a good job for the audience, and I love the craft of writing. So I still did a really, really good job for them every single time. So it's one of those things where if you love the topic, that's even cooler. So if you get all three, that's dream. That's for me, writing the Corn Book, writing Waltzing Australia, I got all three, and that's very exciting. But if you want to make a living as a writer, you sometimes have to sacrifice the topic. I wrote for one magazine for 3 years, and it's after a while they just said, it's like, how about fly fishing? And I'm like, I don't do fly fishing. I don't know anything. And they said, yeah, but you're really good at research, and you can write anything. Because I had written anything for them by then. I had written on everything from the latest in cosmetics to retirement to how to keep a marriage going. And I'm like, I've never been married, so I interview people. I interview people and I read something by an expert. So they're like, fly fishing, okay, you can do it, you can do anything because you're a good writer. So that's the thing, is that you will not always be able to get a topic that's sensationally exciting. But if you want to make a living as a writer, if you learn to fall in love with writing and you learn to always care about your audience getting a good product, that will be enough to carry you. So care deeply is number one. Edit ruthlessly, I've already mentioned. It's basically don't fall in love with your writing. Love the task of writing, but don't fall in love so much with what you've written that you are blinded to the fact that this just doesn't belong here. But like I said earlier, it's also not just a matter of cutting things, it's also a matter of intensifying things, making things more precise. Check everything. That's the third rule, checking everything. And I always say there's only two things you really have to check, and that's all your facts and all your words. The reason you need to check it is because between the internet and the media and the broadcast media, so many things are used incorrectly that it's very easy to pick things up. There was a fad a few years ago for everybody using the word penultimate. Penultimate, it means next to last. But everybody seemed to think, you'd watch evening shows. It's not just the ultimate, it's the penultimate. And I'm going, I mean, it's next to last. You don't know that, do you? So people start using words incorrectly, and then people pick them up and keep that going. And so it's like, look it up before you use it, because the way you've read it is probably wrong. I mean, you don't have to look up but pretty much everything else. It's just one of those things. If it's a larger word, if it isn't something you use all the time, if you're not absolutely certain that especially if you see it on TV. I mean, if you've seen it on TV or heard it on the radio, look it up. As for facts, like I said earlier, 2 or 3 sources always for important facts. Unless you have an eyewitness. If you have an eyewitness, you can just go with one. But it's just one of those things where so many people on the internet are just writing what they think and getting it completely wrong. I think I remember this being, about what I saw, and I read this in high school, and so I should be able to remember this. And you're going, no. So, and even guides sometimes will say something like, and this was built in the 14th century, and you go home and you find out it was built in the 1400s. And since nobody knows the difference between the 1400s and the 14th century anymore, you're off by 100 years. So just check things, just to make sure you're right, because it's amazing how much everybody will just dismiss everything you've written if you get something wrong, because everybody knows something that you don't know. So it's just check everything. Fourth is copying and pasting is not writing. That might not be something that you'd run into in fiction, but it is something you run into a lot in nonfiction. In educational publishing, we have had to create documents on what constitutes plagiarism and send it out because people copy so much stuff. Although there have been some newsworthy things recently about authors who get great book deals and then they find out that they copied the book. So copying and pasting, like I said, it's a huge problem these days because a lot of kids are getting through college doing that for their papers. Copy it off the internet. Even if you type it yourself out of a book, it's still plagiarism, so copying and pasting is not writing. And then the ultimate rule, the fifth rule, is do it. I can't tell you how many people say, oh, I've always thought I would like to write. Well, the difference between a writer and somebody who just doesn't write is writing. So it's basically, if you want to write, if you think you'd like to write, if you think you've got, if this is the goal do it every day. Keep a diary, take notes, always have a notebook with you, jot things down, start, even if you're writing articles for the family, just write all the time, because the only way to get good at writing is by writing. And you will never accomplish anything if you just think that someday you'd like to write. So that's it. Just do it. the Nike ad. So care deeply, edit ruthlessly, check everything. Copying and pasting is not writing, and just do it. That's one of the things that people sort of want somebody to knock on the door and say, "Hi, I've heard you wanted to be a writer. Would you like to write something for us?" It won't happen. So you have to go out there and get writer's market and start finding out who in your neighborhood, write for something free. Go to the grocery store or the bookstore and pick up all those free papers. And they may pay $30. But it's a writing credit. You have to have something to get to the next level. So just start writing and then start submitting to lower level things. Don't start with, National Geographic. Start with the grocery store mailer, because they need stuff all the time. And people turn over very quickly there at those free magazines, because nobody wants to write for $30 an hour or $30 an article forever. So just keep moving forward.
Is there any questions that I haven't asked that you think that I should know?
Well, I think one of the things is, it may sound like I have an awful lot of interests, but they're all kind of interrelated. I like history and geography, and then I'll say, and travel, except travel really is just a fancy term for geography. I mean, it's like if you love travel, you're enjoying history and geography. And if you like food history, that's still history. In fact, it's amazing how much has been triggered in world events by seeking new foods or trying to find a new way to get the old foods. The reason Columbus left Europe is because he wanted to reach the spice lands. So don't like everything, try and figure out what your strong suit is and focus on that. And then once you get to the point where you're accepted as an authority in a certain area, then you can sort of expand. But if you do a little of everything, the world is not good at accepting that, and it also becomes very hard to become an expert. And that's the other trick, is becoming an expert in the couple of things that you do pick. I'm very knowledgeable about geography, and I'm a member of the Society of Women Geographers, and I'm very knowledgeable about travel and food. And so when I talk on those topics, I can talk for hours and hours and hours, and I actually get paid to talk about those things now. But if you can become an expert, it just helps move you along. And then, like you see all the people on rock groups who then become actors or whatever, once you are established in one area, then you can experiment in other areas. But pick a couple of topics and become really, really good at them. I mean, even in fiction, it's one of those things where people think they don't have to know anything to do fiction, but good fiction needs a lot of facts. You need a lot of history, a lot of geography, a lot of background, or potentially a lot of science if you're doing speculative fiction. Or even if you don't do that, a huge knowledge of human nature. You should be reading psychology books. You should be reading books of history, because basically almost all good speculative or science fiction is repeating stories that have already been told. It's just putting them in space. And it sort of makes you smile as you're sitting there watching it going, okay, I remember this story. This is from, Shakespeare, or this is from, Ovid, or this is from... So a huge amount of writing is knowing enough about human nature and about whatever your setting is, whether your setting is science or history or geography. And if you know those things, like I said, get your facts right even if you're doing fiction.
Well, thank you for talking to me about this.
Terrific.
You've answered a lot of the questions that I personally have had about my own work, and it's just been an honor to meet you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's been a delight talking to you. It's always fun talking about writing with another writer.
Yes, well, thank you very much.
Oh.